He stood in the middle of that opulent law office, Armani suit, slicked back hair, a smile like he'd touched heaven, while his family watched him with unspoken words. $30 million. He thought it was his. He'd celebrated, he'd flaunted his wealth, he'd treated others like dirt. But his father, the man who had spent his life building an empire from scratch, was never a fool. He'd prepared for it all. And when the truth was read aloud before everyone, nothing was left for Ethan Hale but shame. If you want to hear this story to the end, like, comment the city you're watching in, so I know how far my story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because the most painful part is yet to begin. My father never wasted words. That was the first thing anyone who knew Victor Hale would tell you. He didn't make speeches at dinner. He didn't explain himself. He didn't soften edges or apologize for silence. When he spoke, you listened, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it 100 times over in ways most people would never fully understand. Victor Hale had built Hale Industries from nothing. From a 2-room office in downtown Hartford with secondhand furniture and a borrowed telephone, he had turned 30 years of relentless discipline into a construction and real estate empire worth over $100 million. He was not lucky. He was not charmed. He was a man who simply refused to quit when quitting would have been the easier and more reasonable choice. I used to think I understood him. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. My name is Olivia Hale. I'm the younger child, the one most people forgot about when they were busy watching my brother Ethan command every room he walked into. Ethan was the firstborn son, and in our family, that mattered in ways that were never spoken out loud but were felt in every single interaction. He had our father's jawline and our mother's charm, and he had learned very early in life that those two things together could get him almost anywhere he wanted to go without ever having to work for it. Ethan was handsome in that effortless, slightly dangerous way. He smiled like he knew something you didn't. He dressed like money even before he had any. And people, investors, women, colleagues, strangers at fundraising galas, they all fell for it, over and over again, because Ethan Hale was the kind of man who made you feel chosen simply by giving you his attention. I loved my brother. I want to be clear about that because what I'm about to tell you is not a story about hatred. It never was. It was a story about a man who had every advantage in the world and still managed to become someone his own father couldn't trust, and the slow, grinding, heartbreaking way that truth finally came to light. My father died on a Tuesday in March. He had been sick for 14 months, a fact he kept largely private, even from us. That was Victor Hale's way. He didn't want pity, and he didn't want hovering, and he especially didn't want the kind of dramatic deathbed reconciliations that he viewed as theater performed for the living rather than genuine acts of love. He died in the house he had lived in for 41 years, in the bedroom where he'd read financial reports until midnight every single night of his working life, with his personal attorney, a man named Gerald Whitmore, sitting in the chair by the window. He did not call for Ethan. He did not call for me either. That detail would not stop eating at me for a long time. The funeral was large. It had to be. Victor Hale had touched too many lives, employed too many people, partnered with too many organizations to slip away quietly. There were city council members and old construction foremen standing side by side at the reception afterward, and I remember thinking that was exactly what my father would have wanted, not because he was sentimental about equality, but because he genuinely respected competence regardless of where it came from. He had more in common with the foremen, honestly. They were the ones who had actually built things with their hands. Ethan was magnificent at the funeral. I mean that in the most complicated possible way. He gave the eulogy, and it was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, the kind of speech that makes strangers cry. And I sat in the front pew watching him and feeling this strange split sensation, like I was watching two versions of my brother at once. There was the one at the podium who spoke about legacy and sacrifice and a father's quiet love. And there was the other one, the one I had watched for the past several months making careless jokes about what he was going to do with his inheritance, the one who had already called 3 different luxury car dealerships, the one who had mentioned more than once at dinner in front of our dying father's housekeeper, that he was thinking of converting the east wing of the family home into a personal entertainment suite. That second version of Ethan was the real one. I had known it for years. But standing there that day, Watching him fold perfectly into the role of grieving son, I found myself hoping I was wrong. Gerald Whitmore called us both to his office 8 days after the burial. Whitmore and associates occupied the 14th floor of a building in the financial district, and the office looked exactly the way you'd imagine a 70-year-old attorney's office to look. Dark wood paneling, walls of legal volumes, a desk the size of a small country, and that particular quality of silence that feels expensive. Gerald Whitmore himself was a thin, careful man with white hair and reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck. He had been my father's attorney for over 25 years. He was the kind of person who chose every word with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, and he never said anything he hadn't already considered from 6 different directions. When Ethan and I sat down across from him that morning, Whitmore folded his hands on the desk and looked at us both for a long moment without speaking. There was someone else in the room, a younger attorney, a woman named Dana Park, who I didn't know, sitting to the side, and she had a stack of folders in front of her and an expression that I could not read. "Thank you both for coming," Whitmore said. "I'll be straightforward. Your father left very specific instructions regarding this meeting, and I intend to honor them to the letter." Ethan had his ankle crossed over his knee, relaxed, practically radiating confidence. He had worn a charcoal suit that probably cost $4,000. He gave Whitmore a brief, easy nod, like a man who has already mentally deposited a check. "The estate," Whitmore continued, opening the top folder in front of him, "has been assessed at a total current value of approximately $112 million, inclusive of real property, business holdings, investment accounts, and liquid assets." I watched Ethan's posture change slightly, an almost imperceptible straightening of the spine, the body's involuntary response to a number that large being spoken out loud in a quiet room. "Of this amount," Whitmore went on, not looking up, "the family home and its contents, valued at approximately $4 million, are bequeathed jointly to both children in equal share. The charitable foundation holdings, approximately $18 million, are transferred to the Hale Family Foundation Board of Directors in accordance with the foundation's existing charter." He paused to turn a page. "The remaining balance, approximately $90 million in business assets, real property portfolios, and cash equivalents, along with a separately designated liquid sum of $30 million specifically referenced in the primary trust document." "That's mine," Ethan said. The room went quiet in a different way. Whitmore looked up from the folder for the first time. He regarded Ethan over the rim of his reading glasses with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely, completely without warmth. "I beg your pardon?" he said. Ethan uncrossed his ankle. "The $30 million. Dad told me years ago. He always said the main inheritance went to the firstborn. That's me. I'm the one who was going to take over the business. We talked about it." "When did you have this conversation?" Whitmore asked. "Multiple times." Ethan spread his hands. "Look, Gerald, I know there's going to be legal process involved, and I respect that. I just want to make sure we all understand the starting point here. The money goes to me. That's what my father intended." Dana Park made a small sound, not quite a cough, and looked down at her folder. Whitmore set down his reading glasses and looked at my brother for a moment. "Mr. Hale," he said, "your father's instructions are contained in a 63-page trust document that he revised most recently 11 months ago. What he intended is stated very precisely in that document. It is not based on remembered conversations. With respect, I'd ask you to allow me to finish." Ethan sat back. The easy smile had dimmed by about 30%, but it was still there. "Of course," he said. "Go ahead." What Whitmore read next did not give Ethan the $30 million outright. It didn't give it to me outright either. What it described was a structured trust, the Victor C. Hammy Hale Legacy Trust, with conditions of transfer that were both specific and, as I would come to understand, devastating in their precision. The trust stipulated that the $30 million would be released to a beneficiary who demonstrated over a period of no less than 18 months following the date of transfer the following: active stewardship of at least one of the family's operating business units demonstrated financial responsibility as evaluated by an independent trustee panel, and a record of conduct consistent with Victor Hale's documented standards for business and personal integrity. There is also, Whitmore said carefully, a disqualification clause. Ethan frowned. What kind of disqualification clause? Any beneficiary who, between the date of the testator's death and the final trustee evaluation, engages in financial conduct that the trustee panel determines to be reckless, irresponsible, or damaging to the Hale family name or business interests. That beneficiary forfeits their right to claim the trust. The room was silent for about 4 seconds. Then Ethan said, "That's absurd. It is your father's expressed wish." "It's a trap." Whitmore folded his hands again. "It is a test, Mr. Hale. Those are not the same thing." Ethan turned to me. I don't know what he was expecting to find on my face. Agreement, maybe. Shared outrage. Sibling solidarity in the face of a legal obstacle. What he found instead was me sitting very still, with my hands in my lap, looking at the surface of the desk and processing a quiet, nauseating realization. Dad had known. He had known, and he had prepared for it, and the question was no longer whether Ethan would pass the test. The question, the real, terrible question, was whether Ethan already knew he was failing it. I need to tell you about the 3 weeks before that meeting, because that's where the story actually begins. The moment our father's condition became critical, the moment the hospice care began and the timeline shifted from months to weeks, something changed in Ethan. I saw it happen almost in real time. It was like watching a man who has been standing in a long, long line finally see the front of it. He became lighter, more energized. He started making phone calls in the hallway outside our father's room at the family house. And when I walked past, I caught fragments. Names of dealerships, the words, "As soon as the paperwork clears." Once the phrase, "I've been waiting a long time for this." I told myself it was grief. That some people process loss by moving toward the future, by planning, by projecting forward into a life where the source of pain no longer exists. I had read that somewhere. I believed it because I needed to believe it. But then, 2 days before my father died, I walked into the kitchen of the family home and found Ethan on the phone, laughing. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh. The real one, the deep, unguarded, fully delighted laugh of someone who has just received extraordinary news. He was standing at the counter with a glass of bourbon, jacket off, tie loosened, and he was laughing with his entire body. He saw me in the doorway, and the laugh didn't stop immediately. It took a conscious effort, and even then, the brightness in his eyes didn't quite disappear. "Sorry," he said, phone still in hand. "Just something funny." "Dad is upstairs," I said. "I know where Dad is, Olivia." There was nothing more to say after that. I turned around and went back upstairs, and I sat in the hallway outside my father's room for the next 2 hours, and I did not cry. I was too angry to cry. That night, my father slept fitfully, and I sat beside his bed reading, and at some point around 2 in the morning, he opened his eyes and looked at me with perfect clarity, the way he sometimes did, these brief windows of lucidity that made the rest of it harder, not easier. "You're still here," he said. "Where else would I be?" He looked at me for a long time. His hand on the blanket was very still. "I need you to trust me," he said finally. I didn't know what he meant. I said, "I do." He closed his eyes again. 2 days later, he was gone. Bad. The week after the will reading was one of the strangest of my life. Ethan left Whitmore's office looking like a man who had been told his steak was going to take 20 minutes longer than expected, inconvenienced, mildly irritated, but absolutely certain the steak was still coming. He called me that night and spoke for 45 minutes about the trust conditions being unnecessarily complex, and clearly the work of Gerald overcomplicating things, and his plan for meeting the stewardship requirements while simultaneously getting things moving on his personal plans. "What personal plans?" I asked. "I'm looking at a place in Scottsdale," he said, "for when I need a break from the Hartford winters, and I'm finalizing the McLaren." "The car." "Yes, the car. I've wanted it for 3 years, Olivia. It's not an extravagance. It's a milestone purchase. I've earned it. The trust hasn't transferred yet." It's formality at this point. Everyone knows where the money is going. Ethan, I'm not spending trust money. I have other accounts. I have my own money. That was technically true, but only if you didn't look too closely at the numbers. Ethan had a career history that was impressive on paper and spotty in practice. He had spent 8 years working for Hale Industries in a senior vice president title that our father had created specifically for him, at a salary that was generous by anyone's standards. But Ethan's lifestyle had always exceeded his income. There had been quiet conversations over the years, loans that weren't quite loans, arrangements that kept things looking stable from the outside. I knew about some of them. I suspected there were others. But when I tried to say any of this, he talked past me. He was very good at talking past people. It was a skill he'd spent a lifetime refining. The McLaren arrived on a Friday, 14 days after the will reading. I found out through Instagram, which was how I found out about most things in Ethan's life that he didn't want to discuss directly. He posted a photo of himself leaning against the car in the driveway of his rented Hartford townhouse, sunglasses on, looking every inch the part. The caption read, "New chapter, new energy, the wait is over." 300 people liked it in the first hour. My phone rang 40 minutes later. It was Dana Park, Gerald Whitmore's associate. "I want to make you aware," she said carefully, "that the trustee panel has been notified of certain financial activities connected to Ethan Hale's accounts in the past 2 weeks." "I saw the car," I said. "The car is one item. There are others." She wasn't at liberty to share details, not at that stage, but the weight in her voice told me enough. I sat down on the edge of my desk in the small office I kept at the Hale Foundation headquarters, and I looked out the window at the Hartford skyline that my father had helped shape, and I felt the specific, exhausting grief of a person who has been right about something terrible and takes no satisfaction in it whatsoever. Over the following 3 weeks, Ethan operated as if the trust conditions were a bureaucratic inconvenience he had already mentally cleared. He threw a party at a venue in the city, a genuine, catered 200-person event, and called it a celebration of Victor's legacy. People came. Of course they came. They always came when Ethan was the host, because Ethan threw spectacular parties and knew how to make everyone feel like the most important person in the room for at least 10 minutes. I attended for 45 minutes and then left. At one point during those 45 minutes, I stood near the bar and listened to Ethan tell a group of his father's former business partners, men in their 60s who had known Victor Hale for decades, about his plans for Hale Industries. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had already taken possession. He talked about restructuring divisions, bringing in new investors, streamlining the old-school elements. He used the phrase dead weight at least twice. And I watched the faces of the men listening to him and saw something move behind their eyes. Not anger exactly, but a kind of troubled recognition. One of them, a man named Stuart Marsh, who had co-developed 3 major projects with my father in the 90s, caught my eye across the room. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a moment with an expression that said, "I see what's happening here. Do you?" I nodded once. He nodded back. Then he made his excuses to Ethan and left. I want to tell you something about my father that most people didn't know. Victor Hale kept journals. Not diaries, he would have rejected that word, but working journals, legal pads filled with handwritten notes about decisions he'd made, problems he was solving, people he was evaluating. He had kept them since his late 30s. There were dozens of them stored in a locked cabinet in his study, and in his final months, he had given me the key. Not Ethan, me. I didn't open the cabinet until 3 weeks after his death. I wasn't ready before that. But the night after Ethan's party, I went to the family home. I still had a key, and I sat at my father's desk at midnight, and I opened the cabinet and I started reading. The most recent journals were the most devastating, not because they were angry. My father's anger, when it surfaced in those pages, was the quiet, measured kind. The kind that comes not from heat, but from accumulated evidence. Entry after entry, going back 4 years, carefully documented, a loan given to Ethan and never repaid, with no acknowledgement. A business decision Ethan had made without authorization that cost the company $200,000 and that had been quietly absorbed by Victor personally. A conversation Ethan had had with an investor that Victor described in his precise and careful handwriting as a performance, the kind designed to charm rather than inform. And I have watched this pattern too long to mistake it for anything other than what it is. And then, much later, near the end, a single entry that stopped me cold. Ethan believes the money will make him safe. He has always believed that. What he does not understand, what I have failed to make him understand, and I accept that failure as mine, is that the money was never meant to make him safe. It was meant to be the beginning of something, not the end of effort, not the reward for simply surviving me. I don't know who he will be without the weight of waiting. I'm afraid I do know. I've tried not to. Olivia is different. She has always been different. She doesn't know how much I've seen. I sat in that study until almost 3 a.m, reading my dead father's handwriting by lamplight, and what I felt was not triumph. It was grief of a very specific and lonely kind. The grief of understanding someone too late to tell them you finally did. The trustee panel had its first formal review 6 weeks after the will reading. By that point, Ethan had acquired the McLaren, put a deposit on a property in Scottsdale, hosted the party, and, this was the one that made even me flinch, had apparently approached 2 of Hale Industries' senior investors directly with a proposal for restructuring that he had developed without consulting Gerald Whitmore, without consulting the existing board, and without any legal standing to do so whatsoever. One of those investors had called Whitmore immediately. The second had called the Hartford Business Journal. The article that ran was not unkind exactly, but it used the phrase "questions surrounding the leadership succession at Hale Industries" in the headline. And in business circles, that kind of headline is its own kind of damage. I learned about the trustee review meeting from Dana Park, who called me the day before. "I want to be clear," she said, "that I'm informing you of this meeting in your capacity as a potential alternate beneficiary as outlined in the trust document." I remember being very still on the other end of that call. "Alternate beneficiary," I repeated. "Section 12 of the trust," she said. "I'd suggest you review it before tomorrow." I found Section 12 of the trust document that night. Whitmore had given me a copy at the original reading, and I read it 3 times. It stated that in the event the primary designated beneficiary was disqualified under the conduct clause, the trustee panel was authorized to evaluate alternate beneficiaries based on documented evidence of stewardship, competence, and alignment with the testator's stated values. There was a footnote that cited specifically the Hale Family Foundation records. I had been managing the foundation's operations for 4 years. I had the records. My father had known exactly what he was doing. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was excited. I want to be very careful about that, because the story is easy to misread at this point as a story about winning, and it was never that. I didn't sleep because I was sitting in the middle of a reality that felt almost too heavy to hold. My father was gone. My brother was about to lose something he had counted on his entire life. And somewhere underneath all of that was a version of our family that could have been different, that should have been different, that we were all going to have to live with regardless of what happened next. I thought about calling Ethan. I picked up my phone twice. Both times, I put it back down. What would I have said? "They're reviewing the trust tomorrow, and you're going to fail it?" The car was a mistake. The party was a mistake. The investor meetings were a mistake. And Dad saw all of this coming from 4 years away? You spent your whole life performing for him, and he was taking notes the entire time? Nothing I said would have landed. I knew that. I had known it for years. So I sat with it instead. I sat with all of it. The love and the anger and the bone-deep exhaustion of being the sibling who watches and worries and quietly manages and never quite gets seen doing any of it. And I let the night pass around me, and when the morning came, I got dressed and I drove to Whitmore's office. And I did not know yet exactly how bad it was going to get before it got better. But I knew it was going to get bad. My father had never been wrong about that kind of thing. And sitting in that car outside Whitmore's building, hands on the wheel, watching the Hartford morning traffic move past the window, I finally understood what he had meant 2 days before he died, when he'd looked at me in the lamplight and said, "I need you to trust me." He hadn't been asking me to trust him. He had been telling me to. The trustee review meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m, and I arrived at 7:45. I don't know exactly why I came that early. Some part of me needed to be in that building before Ethan arrived, needed to sit in that waiting room with the expensive silence and the dark wood paneling and just breathe. Just exist in the space for a few minutes before everything shifted again. I had barely slept. I had read Section 12 of the trust document 4 more times between 2 and 4 in the morning, and each time I read it, the same thought surfaced, and I pushed it back down. He planned this for me. He planned all of it for me, and he never said a word. Gerald Whitmore arrived at 8:15 and found me in the waiting room with a paper cup of bad coffee from the cart downstairs. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You read Section 12. "Last night," I said. He nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he already knew. "Your father asked me not to mention it to you directly. He felt it was important that you come to this on your own terms." "He could have just told me," I said. "He could have talked to me." Whitmore sat down in the chair across from me. For a 70-year-old man who projected absolute formality in every professional setting I'd ever seen him in, he looked, in that moment, almost tired. "Your father was many things, Olivia. Straightforward with his feelings was not always one of them. He showed people what he thought of them through what he built for them, not through what he said." I looked down at my coffee cup. "He built you a door," Whitmore said. "Whether you walk through it is your choice." We sat quietly for a moment after that. Then Dana Park arrived, followed by the 2 external trustees my father had named in the document, a woman named Patricia Cho, who had served on the boards of 3 major Connecticut nonprofits, and a man named Robert Ashby, who had spent 30 years in corporate finance. Neither of them knew me personally. Both of them had reviewed the foundation records I'd submitted, along with a summary document Dana had apparently been compiling for the past month. I hadn't known about the summary document. When Dana slid a copy across the conference table to me before the meeting started, I realized it was a detailed record of 4 years' worth of my work: grant approvals, financial audits, partnership agreements, donor relationships, operational decisions. Someone had gone through the Foundation's files with extraordinary care and assembled something that looked, on paper, like a quietly impressive career that most people had never noticed, because it happened in a building that didn't have my brother's name on the outside. "Your father provided this template to my office 14 months ago," Dana said when she saw my face. "He asked us to populate it as his condition progressed." 14 months ago. He had been sick for 14 months. He had spent those 14 months not just dying, but engineering this. I sat with that for a second and felt something complicated move through me. Not quite gratitude, not quite anger, something in between that didn't have a clean name. Then the door to the conference room opened and Ethan walked in, and whatever I was feeling got set aside immediately, because Ethan walked in the way he always walked into rooms, like the room had been waiting for him. And then he saw the assembled faces and the folders on the table, and something in his expression flickered. "Morning," he said, easy and controlled. He took the chair directly across from Whitmore without being directed to it, which was classic Ethan, always claiming the power position instinctively, always orienting himself toward whoever he perceived as the decision-maker. He glanced at me and gave me a brief nod. Then he looked at the summary document in front of me, and his eyes stayed on it 1 second too long. "Let's begin," Whitmore said. What followed was one of the more excruciating hours of my adult life, and I have had some genuinely excruciating hours. Whitmore walked through the trust's evaluation criteria methodically, the way he did everything, without drama, without editorializing, just the plain architecture of what the document required and what the evidence showed. Patricia Cho and Robert Ashby asked questions. They were not hostile questions, but they were precise, and precision was not Ethan's natural environment when the topic was accountability. "Mr. Hale," Robert Ashby said at one point, in the measured tone of a man who has spent 3 decades in boardrooms delivering uncomfortable truths, "the trust document requires demonstrated financial responsibility. Our review of your recent activity shows a vehicle purchase in excess of $300,000, a real estate deposit of approximately $80,000, and event expenditures of roughly $40,000, all within 6 weeks of your father's death during the trust's active evaluation window." Ethan's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Those were personal expenditures, personal funds." Can you document the source of those funds separately from any estate assets or anticipated inheritance? A pause. Brief, but real. My accountant can provide. We've been in contact with your accountant, Dana Park said, without looking up from her folder. Another pause. Longer. The funds were partly drawn against a personal line of credit, Ethan said, which I intend to repay from the trust distribution. Ashby looked at him steadily. So the spending was premised on receiving the trust. It was premised on a reasonable expectation. The trust document classifies that as exactly the kind of anticipatory spending the disqualification clause was designed to address, Whitmore said, and his voice was completely flat, completely without cruelty, and somehow that made it worse. Ethan turned to look at me then, not with the brief, casual nod from earlier, but a real look, searching, like he was trying to read whether I had somehow caused this. I met his eyes, and I didn't look away, and I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. "Olivia," he said, and just his tone when he said my name sent a chill across my shoulders. "Did you know about this evaluation before today?" "Dana called me yesterday," I said. "Yesterday." Something shifted in his face. "And you didn't call me." "I didn't know the details," I said. "I knew there was a review." "You knew." He said it quietly, not loud, not explosive, quiet, which from Ethan was actually more alarming. "You sat on that and you let me walk in here blind." "Ethan, I'm your brother." "I know that." "Then why?" "Because I didn't know how to tell you," I said, and my voice came out more unsteady than I wanted it to. "Because every time I've tried to tell you something you didn't want to hear for the past 20 years, you've looked at me like I'm the problem, like I'm the one being difficult. And I was tired, Ethan. I was exhausted. Dad just died, and I was tired of being the one who—" I stopped. The room was very still. Patricia Cho had set down her pen. "I'm sorry," I said. "That's not relevant to this proceeding." "It's relevant to me," Ethan said, and for just a second, one unguarded, unperformed second, he looked like the version of him I remembered from when we were children, before the charm became a strategy, before the smile became a tool. He just looked like my brother, lost and cornered and genuinely not understanding how he had ended up here. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then the expression sealed over again, and he turned back to Whitmore. "Tell me what I need to do to fix this," he said. Whitmore exchanged a brief look with the two trustees. "The evaluation period has another 12 months to run," he said carefully. "The panel has not made a final determination. However, the current evidence—" "I know what the current evidence looks like," Ethan said. "I'm asking what I need to do." "Step back from the investor discussions you've initiated independently. Cease all expenditures that could be construed as premised on the trust distribution. Demonstrate active, documented stewardship of a Hale Industries operating unit, as defined in Section 7 of the document. And," Whitmore paused slightly, "address the outstanding loan balance." Ethan went still. "What loan balance?" Dana slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Ethan looked at it. The color didn't drain from his face exactly, but something in his expression changed in a way that told me the number on that sheet was not a surprise. It was just a number he had hoped no one in this room would ever say out loud. "That's a private arrangement," Ethan said, "between me and Dad." "Your father documented it as a conditional loan in his financial records," Whitmore said. "The trust treats it as an outstanding obligation of the estate. It does not disappear. The number, I would learn later, was $430,000, accumulated over 11 years, never formally acknowledged, never repaid." Ethan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and I had the strange, sad sensation of watching someone finally see the full shape of a room they'd been standing in for years. He didn't speak to me afterward. He walked out of Whitmore's office ahead of me, jacket button done up, phone already to his ear, and by the time I reached the elevator, he was already in it, face pointed at the doors, and he did not hold them for me. I stood in the hallway and listened to the elevator close, and felt the familiar, weary ache of being Ethan's sister, the one who loved him and couldn't reach him, and was somehow always the one standing in the hallway. I took the stairs. Outside, the Hartford morning had turned gray, clouds coming in low from the west, I sat in my car for 10 minutes without starting it, and I thought about my father's journal entries and the summary document Dana had assembled from 4 years of my work, and the way Ethan had looked when that loan number appeared on paper, and I thought, this is what it looks like when a story that was always going to end this way finally starts ending. It wasn't satisfying. It was just sad. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Not Ethan. It was Stuart Marsh, the old business partner who had caught my eye at the party. I heard there was a trustee meeting this morning, he said, without preamble. Word travels fast. In this city, among this particular set of people? He made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Your father understood that. He built half his relationships on that fact. A pause. How did it go? It went the way it was going to go, I said. And Ethan? I looked out the windshield at the gray sky. He left without saying goodbye. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Your father asked me something about 8 months ago. He called me out of nowhere. This was when he was sick. I knew he was sick. And he asked me to be honest with him about Ethan. About what I'd seen over the years, I told him. Another pause. I want you to know that I told him honestly, and that what I told him wasn't easy to say, and that he listened to all of it without interrupting me. And when I finished, he said, "Thank you. I already knew. I just needed to hear it from someone who wasn't trying to protect him." I pressed my fingers against my eyes and breathed. He knew, Olivia. He knew for a long time. The trust wasn't punishment. He was very clear about that when we spoke. What was it then? Stuart Marsh took a breath. He called it a mirror, he said. He said he wanted Ethan to finally see himself clearly. And he said that if Ethan couldn't do that, if Ethan walked straight into every trap he'd laid out deliberately, then the money needed to go somewhere, it would mean something. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. A mirror. My father had spent a year of his dying building a mirror for his son, and Ethan had walked into it eyes open and seen nothing but his own reflection looking back, and had still not recognized what he was seeing. The next several weeks were difficult in ways I hadn't quite anticipated. I had expected Ethan to go quiet after the meeting, to retreat, regroup, maybe come back with a lawyer and a counter strategy. What I hadn't expected was for him to go loud. He didn't go loud publicly. Ethan was too smart for that, too image conscious. But within the ecosystem of the family and its extended social world, he went loud. Calls to cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, framing the trust situation as Gerald overcomplicating things and Olivia being used as a pawn. A lunch with two of our mother's sisters that I only found out about because one of them, Aunt Carla, called me directly afterward, sounding rattled. He said your father was not in his right mind when he made the trust changes, she told me. He said the hospice medication affected his judgment. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That's not true. I know it's not true, she said. I'm telling you because I thought you should know what he's saying. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't think Victor Hale had ever made a single decision in his life that he wasn't fully in control of, and that if I were Ethan, I would be very careful about making claims that could be legally tested. I exhaled. Thank you, Carla. Your father was a complicated man, she said, and her voice softened slightly at the edges. But he was not unkind, and he loved you both, even if he showed it in ways that were hard to read. After I hung up, I sat at my desk at the foundation and looked at the stack of files in front of me. Grant applications, budget proposals, a partnership letter for a workforce development program we were funding in 3 neighborhoods that my father had grown up near. And I thought about what it meant to be the person who actually does the work while someone else performs the idea of it. I thought about all the years I had spent in this office, or its predecessor on the other side of town, doing exactly this, building something real, piece by piece, without anyone watching, without anyone calling it impressive. I had never minded, or I had told myself I hadn't minded. But sitting there with Carla's words still in my ear, with the knowledge of what Ethan was doing in rooms I wasn't in, I let myself feel it, just for a minute, the weight of always being the one who shows up and does the actual thing while someone else takes up all the space. My father had seen it. He had seen it for years, in silence, and built his mirror, and left me a door. It would have been easier if he'd just said it once, just once, in a room with both of us, where Ethan could have heard it directly instead of learning it from a 63-page legal document. But Victor Hale had not been built that way, and I had stopped waiting for a version of him that didn't exist. 3 days after Aunt Carla's call, Ethan came to my apartment. He showed up at 8 in the evening without calling, which was either an oversight or a strategy. With Ethan, it was sometimes hard to tell. I opened the door and he was standing in the hallway in jeans and a gray sweater, hands in his pockets, and for a disorienting second he looked so much like our father in his younger photos that I had to consciously reset. "Can I come in?" he said. I stepped back and let him in. He sat on my couch and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. I went to the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of water, came back, and sat across from him. The silence between us wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who have known each other their entire lives and have run out of the easier versions of conversation. Finally, he picked up his water glass and said, "How long did you know?" "Know what specifically?" "About the loan? About the journals? About all of it?" "I found the journals 3 weeks ago," I said. "The loan. I didn't know the amount until the meeting." He nodded slowly. "What did the journals say about me?" I thought about how to answer that. I could have softened it. I could have redirected. But I was too tired for either of those things, and something in his face, a rawness I didn't often see there, told me he wasn't asking so he could argue. He was asking because he actually wanted to know. "That he loved you," I said, "and that he didn't know how to reach you, and that he was afraid the money would finish off something that was already fragile." Ethan stared at his water glass for a moment. He could have talked to me. "You know that's not how he was." "I know," he exhaled. "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Olivia, I need the trust to work out. The line of credit situation is worse than I let on in that meeting. The car, the deposit, I'm overextended. I've been overextended for a while. I kept thinking it would resolve when the money came," I said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I looked at my brother, really looked at him. And what I saw was not the polished, performing version, not the man who laughed in the kitchen while our father was dying upstairs, not the Armani suit and the McLaren and the 200 people at the party. I saw a 53-year-old man sitting on my couch who had spent his entire adult life waiting for an inheritance to make him whole, and was only now beginning to understand that it was never going to do that, because the problem was never the money. "I can't fix the trust for you," I said. "I can't intervene with the trustees. You know that." "I know. And I can't keep pretending to be surprised when things keep going the way they're going." He looked up at me then. "But you're my brother," I said. "And Dad is gone. And whatever happens with the trust, I'm not going anywhere." He held my gaze for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully name. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't gratitude. It was something older than both of those, something closer to the bone. "I really screwed this up," he said quietly. "Yeah," I said. "You did." He gave a short, humorless exhale. "Are you going to tell me it's fixable?" I thought about the loan balance and the line of credit and the investors he'd already spooked and the trustees' expressions at that conference table. I thought about 12 months left in the evaluation window and the size of the gap between where Ethan was and where the trust required him to be. "I think there are things that can't be undone," I said, "and I think you know that, but I also think—" I stopped, chose carefully. "I think Dad wasn't trying to destroy you. I think he was trying to stop you from destroying yourself. And whether that worked is still—" I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. Ethan sat on my couch for another hour that night. We didn't talk about the trust again. We talked about small things. A restaurant we'd both liked as children that had closed years ago, a trip our parents had taken before we were born, a particular memory of our father at a company picnic when Ethan was 9 and I was 6, laughing at something neither of us could remember. The only time either of us had seen him laugh like that in public. When Ethan left, he paused in my doorway. "I'm going to try," he said. "I don't know if it's going to be enough, but I'm going to try." I nodded. "I know." After the door closed, I stood in my apartment in the quiet and listened to the building settle around me and I thought about my father's final words to me. And I thought about mirrors, and I thought about how the most painful kind of love is the kind that cannot reach the person it's meant for until everything else has been stripped away. I thought about 12 months. I thought about what trying actually looked like, and whether Ethan had ever truly done it, and whether it was too late, and whether it mattered that it might be. I didn't have answers to any of those questions that night. What I had instead was the feeling of standing at the edge of something large and unresolved, in a family that had always kept its most important things unspoken, watching the silence finally start to crack. Ethan tried. I want to give him that because the story is too easy if I don't. For about 6 weeks after that night on my couch, he genuinely tried. He pulled back from the Scottsdale property, forfeited the deposit, which hurt, but it was the right move and he knew it. He stopped posting on social media. He returned 2 calls from the independent investors he'd approached recklessly and walked back the restructuring proposal with what I was told was a reasonably graceful acknowledgement that he had acted outside his authority. He even showed up at Hale Industries' Hartford office 3 days a week, sitting in on operational meetings for the commercial development division, taking notes, not talking over people. I heard about the note-taking from Marcus Webb, the division's operations manager, who had worked under my father for 16 years. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening, sounding cautiously optimistic in the way of a man who has been burned by optimism before and isn't ready to fully commit to it again. He sat through a 4-hour procurement review without once trying to redirect the conversation toward himself, Marcus said. For Ethan, that's something. It is, I agreed. How long do you think it lasts? I didn't answer that. I didn't want to be the person who answered that. But here's what I knew, sitting in my apartment that Wednesday night with Marcus's cautious words still hanging in the air. Trying is not the same as changing. Trying is what you do when the consequences are immediate and visible and bearing down on you. Changing is something different. It's slower and uglier, and it requires a person to look at themselves without flinching. And I had never in my life seen Ethan Hale look at himself without flinching. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known yet, was that something was already moving in the background, something that would make the next 2 months feel, in retrospect, like the quiet before the kind of storm that rearranges the landscape permanently. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to receive. Dana Park called my cell on a Thursday morning, and from the first 2 seconds of the call, I could tell something was different. Her voice had that particular quality of careful that legal professionals develop when they're operating near the edge of what they're permitted to say. I need to flag something, she said, off the record, informally, as someone who has been involved in this process since the beginning. Okay, I said slowly. We've received a letter, addressed to Gerald Whitmore, from an attorney representing a third party who claims to have documentation relevant to the trust evaluation. I set down the coffee I was holding. What kind of documentation? The letter is vague in the way letters from attorneys are deliberately vague before they're ready to be specific. But the claim, the broad claim, is that there exist records that contradict elements of your father's trust document, specifically regarding his mental capacity during the revision 11 months before his death. The room felt suddenly smaller. Someone is challenging the trust, I said. The letter doesn't use that language yet, but that's the direction it points. Who is the third party? A pause. The letter doesn't name them directly. The attorney is a man named Craig Lester. I looked him up. He operates primarily in estate litigation, high-conflict cases. I knew the name. Not well, but enough. Craig Lester had a reputation in Hartford legal circles for taking cases that other attorneys considered too messy or too ugly. The kind of inheritance fights that ended up in newspapers and left families unrecognizable to themselves. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time and stared at nothing in particular and tried to figure out who would have hired Craig Lester and what they thought they were going to find. And then slowly, a thought surfaced that I tried to push back down and couldn't. Ethan had said, after the first trustee review, that he was going to try. He had sat on my couch and looked genuinely undone and said the words out loud. But Ethan had also spent 45 years learning that there was always another angle, always another move, always some way to renegotiate the terms of a situation he didn't like. And challenging the mental capacity of a dead man who could no longer defend himself was, in its own terrible way, exactly the kind of move that required no self-examination at all, because it made the problem Victor's fault instead of Ethan's. I did not call Ethan that day. I needed to be wrong before I accused him of anything, and I was not yet certain I was right. But I wasn't sleeping well, and I was watching my phone more than I should have been. The letter became official 14 days later. Gerald Whitmore called both of us to his office, separately this time, which itself told you something. And when I sat across from him and Dana on a gray Tuesday afternoon, he laid out the situation with the same careful, unadorned precision he brought to everything. A formal challenge had been filed against the trust revision. The challenging party was identified as a man named Raymond Doyle, a name I didn't recognize at all, and that absence of recognition itself felt wrong, like a word in a sentence that shouldn't be there. Raymond Doyle claimed to have been a private business associate of Victor Hale's in the late years of his life, and his attorney, Craig Lester, was asserting that Victor had been unduly influenced during the trust revision process, and that the trust as written did not reflect Victor's true intentions. "Who is Raymond Doyle?" I asked. Whitmore folded his hands. "That's what I've spent the past week determining. Mr. Doyle appears to have entered your father's professional orbit approximately 2 years before Victor's death. He was involved in 2 real estate transactions in a peripheral capacity, a consultant role, not a principal. And he had, according to records we've been able to access, a personal relationship with your father that extended beyond those transactions." "What kind of personal relationship?" "Unclear. Your father's personal calendar shows 17 meetings with Doyle over an 18-month period. None of them are documented in any of Victor's working journals, which is unusual." That detail landed heavily. My father documented everything. The fact that 17 meetings with one person left no trace in his journals meant one of 2 things. Either he had deliberately kept them off the record, or someone had removed the pages. I had the journals. I had been through them extensively. I thought of the places where the narrative seemed to skip, entries that jumped days when my father had never previously gone more than 48 hours without writing something. I had attributed it to fatigue, to the illness slowing him down. I had not considered another explanation. "Does Ethan know Raymond Doyle?" I asked. Whitmore looked at me for a moment before answering. "That is one of the questions we are currently investigating." I drove to Ethan's townhouse that evening without calling ahead. He answered the door in running clothes, hair damp, like he'd just come in from outside, and when he saw my face, something shifted behind his eyes. Fast, barely perceptible. The way a person's expression changes when they've been expecting a conversation and have been rehearsing for it. That micro-expression told me everything I needed to know. I walked in anyway. "Craig Lester," I said. Ethan turned and walked toward the kitchen. "You want coffee or something?" "Ethan?" "I heard you." He stood at the counter with his back to me for a second, then turned around. His face had settled into something controlled and careful. "I didn't hire him." "Then who did?" "Raymond brought him in. That was Raymond's call." "Raymond Doyle?" "Yes." "Who is he to you?" Ethan crossed his arms, leaned against the counter. "He's someone I met at a charity event about 2.5 years ago. We had some conversations. About Dad, about the business, about... Look, I was frustrated, Olivia. I was frustrated about the way Dad was shutting me out of decisions, and Raymond was someone who listened. That's all." "That's all," I repeated. "I didn't tell him to file anything. I didn't ask him to challenge the trust." "But you talked to him about the trust." A pause. "I may have mentioned that I thought the revision was..." "You gave him enough to work with," I said. "Whether you signed a retainer or not, you gave him the shape of a case and he went and found a lawyer to build it." Ethan's jaw set. "You don't know that." "I know you, I said, and the words came out with a flatness that surprised even me. Not angry, just tired. Deeply, structurally tired in the way of someone who has been making the same circuit through the same argument for 20 years. "I know that you didn't sit on my couch and tell me you were going to try and simultaneously pick up a phone and call a stranger to undermine a legal document our dead father spent a year building. I know you didn't consciously do both of those things at the same time, But I also know that you have spent your whole life finding ways to have it both directions, and this is just another version of that." He was quiet for a long moment. "If the trust gets invalidated," he said finally, "we go back to standard succession. That's better for both of us." "It's better for you," I said. "It's better for the version of you that doesn't want to be accountable for the past 6 weeks of decisions." "Olivia?" "Ethan, Dad documented everything. Everything. If Craig Lester goes into that legal process, Whitmore is going to put those journals into evidence. Every entry, every loan, every documented instance of Dad watching you and writing down what he saw." I stepped toward him slightly. "You think a mental capacity challenge helps you? It will take everything he wrote about you and put it in front of a judge." The color changed in Ethan's face. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for that, but I saw it. The specific pallor of someone who has just understood the full geometry of a trap they walked into themselves. "He wrote about me," he said, "for years." Silence. "How bad is it?" he asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly without being brutal. I thought about the entry that had stopped me cold. I'm afraid I do know. And the ones before it and after it, 4 years of careful observation that added up to a portrait no son would want to read. "It's honest," I said. He didn't hate you. That's important and it's real. But he didn't trust you. And he wrote down exactly why, with dates and amounts and specifics that will hold up in any proceeding Craig Lester wants to start." Ethan put both hands on the counter behind him and looked at the floor. "I need you to call Raymond Doyle," I said, "tonight, and tell him to stand down. And if I don't, then Whitmore files a counter motion. The journals go into evidence, and the next 6 months of your life are a public legal proceeding about your character and your financial history in the city where you have lived your entire life, in front of everyone who knew your father." I paused. "That's your choice." He didn't answer immediately. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, headlights sweeping briefly through the window. "You could have come to me before it got filed," he said, "when you first found out." "I could have," I said. "But I didn't know if you'd already made your decision, and I needed to know. Now you know." "Now I know." He exhaled, long and slow, the kind of exhale that carries something heavier than air. "I'll call him," he said. "I'll tell him to withdraw." "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said, and his voice had an edge that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pain, but was somewhere in that difficult middle space. "This isn't me being noble. This is me running out of options." "I know the difference," I said. "That's okay." "What?" Raymond Doyle withdrew the challenge 4 days later. The legal paperwork came through Whitmore's office on a Friday, and Dana Park sent me a text that said simply, "Withdrawn." I sat at my desk at the foundation, read the word, and felt not relief but the particular hollow exhaustion that follows a crisis that was entirely avoidable. But the damage was not zero. These things never leave zero damage. The challenge, even withdrawn, even before it was fully litigated, had been noticed. In the legal and business community of a city like Hartford, a challenge to the Victor Hale Trust was not the kind of thing that stayed quiet. There were conversations at the Hartford Club and in conference rooms and over drinks after work, and the shape of those conversations was not kind to Ethan. Words like erratic and entitled were being spoken in rooms where they would eventually matter. Marcus Webb called me again, less cautiously optimistic this time. "The people Ethan was starting to build some credibility with in the division," he said. "They've pulled back, not explicitly. Nobody's going to say it directly, but the energy has changed." I thanked him for telling me and sat with that for a long time. The hardest part, the part I kept circling back to in the evenings when the foundation offices were empty and the building was quiet around me, was that Ethan had done exactly what my father predicted. Not because Victor Hale was psychic, not because he had set a clever trap and watched his son spring it, but because he had watched his son for 50 years and understood something about him that Ethan had never been required to understand about himself. That under pressure, Ethan's instinct was always to find an exit rather than go through the door. The trust, with its 18-month evaluation and its disqualification clauses and its careful documentation requirements, had not been designed to punish that instinct. It had been designed to make it visible, to hold it up in the light until the person it belonged to could no longer avoid seeing it. Whether Ethan was seeing it yet, really seeing it, in the bone-deep way that changes how a person operates, I still wasn't sure. What I was sure of was this. The final trustee evaluation was now less than 7 months away, and Ethan's account was nearly empty of the goodwill and credibility he had needed to build, and the one significant gesture he had made toward changing, the 6 weeks of showing up at the office and taking notes and staying quiet, had been undermined by the thing he had set in motion when he thought no one was watching. And the worst part, the part that kept me up at some nights more than others, was not the money. I want to be very clear about that. The $30 million was significant, and I understood its significance, and I am not the kind of person who pretends that money doesn't matter when it clearly does. But what kept me up was the journal entry, the one near the end, the one in my father's careful handwriting. I don't know who he will be without the weight of waiting. I'm afraid I do know. I've tried not to. My father had been right. And he had known he was right for years and had carried that knowledge alone. And now he was gone. And Ethan was standing at the edge of something that looked increasingly like a permanent reckoning, and there was no one left to carry it but me. The final formal hearing was set for the second week of November. Gerald Whitmore notified us both by letter. Formal, dated, sent by courier, which was his way of signaling that what came next was no longer informal in any sense. The letter outlined the proceeding. The trustee panel would convene, review the full 18 months of documented evidence, hear from both potential beneficiaries, and issue a final determination regarding the trust distribution. I read my letter twice, folded it, and put it in the folder I had been keeping since the first morning in Whitmore's office. Ethan called me 20 minutes after I received mine. He had read his. November 11th, he said. Yes. A long pause. Are you prepared? I've been doing my job for 4 years, I said. The records are what they are. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the performance, and what was underneath it was something I recognized as real because I had so rarely heard it from him. I think I already know how this ends, he said. I didn't say anything. I think Dad already knew too, he said. I think that's what the whole thing was. He already knew. Outside my window, the Hartford afternoon was turning toward evening, the light going orange and low across the buildings my father had helped put there. I thought about 23 years of journal entries. I thought about a door and a mirror and a man who showed his love through what he built instead of what he said. Yeah, I said finally. I think he did. The silence between us after that was different from the earlier ones. Not the silence of two people who can't reach each other, but the silence of two people who have finally, painfully, arrived at the same understanding. It had taken 50 years and a dead father and 63 pages of legal document and a withdrawn lawsuit and $430,000 in undocumented loans to get here. But we were here, and November was coming. November came the way hard things always come. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just quietly and on schedule. The way a date circled on a calendar becomes real only when you wake up and realize it's today. I had slept badly the night before the hearing. Not from anxiety exactly, or not only that. It was something more complicated, the kind of sleeplessness that comes when a long story is approaching its final pages and some part of you is not ready for the ending, even when you've known what it was going to be for months. I lay in my apartment in the dark and thought about my father, about his journals and his silence and the particular love language of a man who showed everything through what he built and almost nothing through what he said. I thought about a 6-year-old version of myself at a company picnic, watching my father laugh, not knowing that image would have to last me the rest of my life. I thought about Ethan on my couch, exhausted, saying I think I already know how this ends. I got up at 5:30 and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my folder of documents and went through everything one more time. Not because I needed to, I had been through it so many times the pages had soft edges, but because the act of sitting with it felt necessary, like bearing witness to something. My father had built this structure over the last year of his life, piece by careful piece, and the least I could do was understand every part of it before it reached its conclusion. At 7:15, my phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. I'll be there at 9. Don't worry about me. I read it twice. The words were simple, and I couldn't fully decode what was underneath them, whether it was resignation or genuine steadiness or something he was performing for my benefit or for his own. With Ethan, those things had always been layered in ways I couldn't always separate. I typed back, "Okay, see you there." And then I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment before setting it down. Whitmore's conference room felt different that morning. I don't know exactly how to describe it. The furniture was the same, the dark paneling was the same. Gerald Whitmore was sitting at the head of the table in the same precise, contained way he always sat. But the room felt heavier, the way a space feels when everyone in it understands that what happens here is final. No more reviews, no more evaluation windows, no more carefully worded letters with future dates. This was the end of the process my father had set in motion 14 months before he died. Patricia Cho and Robert Ashby were already seated when I arrived. Dana Park was at the side table with a laptop and 3 stacked folders. 2 other people I didn't know were seated along the wall. Associates from Whitmore's firm, I assumed, there to observe and document. I sat in the chair I had occupied at the first meeting, which I realized was a habit I'd developed without noticing, returning to the same position, the same angle of sight. There was something grounding about it. Ethan arrived at 8:58. He was dressed well. Not the Armani from the first meeting, but a dark navy suit I recognized as something he'd owned for years, well made, but not showy. His hair was slightly less styled than usual. He looked tired in the particular way that can't be covered by good grooming, the tiredness that lives behind the eyes. He nodded to me when he came in, nodded to Whitmore, took his seat. He did not look like a man who expected to win. That was the first time I had ever seen that on him, and it sat on his face in a way that made him look, paradoxically, more like himself than he had in months. Whitmore opened the proceedings at 9 o'clock exactly. The formal presentation lasted 2.5 hours. Robert Ashby led the financial review, and it was thorough in the way that thorough can be devastating. He walked through the 18-month evaluation period in chronological order: the McLaren, the Scottsdale deposit, the party expenditures, the unauthorized investor meetings, the outstanding loan balance, the Raymond Doyle situation, and the subsequent withdrawal. He presented each item without editorializing, in the flat language of financial documentation, and the cumulative effect of hearing it all laid out sequentially, without gaps or softening, was significant. Even I, who had lived through each of those events individually, felt the weight of them differently assembled into a single, unbroken timeline. Ethan sat through all of it without interrupting. He had a legal pad in front of him, and he made occasional notes, though I wasn't sure what he was writing. He kept his face neutral and his posture straight, and I noticed that he was gripping his pen more tightly than he needed to. Then Patricia Cho presented the stewardship evaluation. 6 weeks of showing up at the Commercial Development Division. 4 meetings attended, 2 operational reviews participated in. A brief period of apparent engagement that had, following the Doyle challenge, largely stopped. Mr. Hale's direct involvement with Hale Industries operations, Patricia Cho said, reading from her notes in a measured voice, was documented for a period of approximately 42 days. Following the legal challenge filing and withdrawal, documented engagement effectively ceased. In the panel's assessment, this does not constitute sustained stewardship as defined in Section 7 of the trust document. 42 days, out of an 18-month window. I had not done the math that explicitly before, and hearing it stated that plainly was like watching something become irreversible in real time. Ethan wrote something on his legal pad. Then Whitmore turned to me. My portion of the presentation was different in tone. Not because anyone was trying to create a contrast, or at least I don't believe that was the intention, but simply because the evidence was different in nature. Dana walked through the foundation records. 4 years of operational oversight, grant approvals totaling $11 million, 3 major institutional partnerships developed from initial contact to full execution, 2 operational audits completed that had each resulted in improved efficiency and cost savings that were documented and measurable, a workforce development program that was now in its 3rd year and had served over 400 people in neighborhoods my father had grown up in. I had not assembled those numbers myself. Dana had done it from the records. Sitting there listening to it read back, I felt something unexpected. Not pride exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition, like seeing your own handwriting on something you'd forgotten you wrote. That was 4 years of my life. I had been in that building doing that work, and I had not stood back and looked at the shape of it until someone else laid it out in a conference room and read it into the record. After Dana finished, Whitmore asked each of us to make a brief statement, no longer than 10 minutes, an opportunity to address the panel directly before they deliberated. Ethan went first. He set down his pen and looked at the 3 people across the table, Whitmore, Cho, Ashby, and he took a breath, and what came out was not the polished eulogy voice from the funeral, not the charming boardroom version, not the man who could make a room feel chosen. It was something lower and less constructed, and because of that, it was the most genuinely compelling thing I had ever heard my brother say in a professional context. "I'm not going to stand up here and tell you I met the conditions," he said. "The record is what it is, and you've read it. I know what it looks like." He paused, working something through. "What I want to say, the only thing I can honestly say, is that I understand now what my father was trying to do. I didn't understand it when he died. I thought the trust was an obstacle. I spent months treating it like a bureaucratic problem to solve around rather than a question I was supposed to answer about myself." He looked down at the table briefly, then back up. "I answered it wrong. I think I knew I was answering it wrong in real time, and I kept going anyway, because stopping and actually looking at the pattern was something I'd been avoiding my whole life." He stopped. The room was very quiet. "I'm not asking for the trust," he said. "I'm not asking for anything today. I just didn't want to sit here and let the record speak for itself without saying that I understand what it says. My father deserved that much." He sat back down. He picked up his pen. He did not look at me. I had to breathe for a moment before I could start my own statement. Not because I was emotional, or not only that, but because what Ethan had just said was the most honest thing I had heard from him in my entire adult life, and it had arrived here, in this room, at this table, after all of it, and I didn't know yet what to do with the fact that it was too late, and also, somehow, not nothing. I stood and I spoke for 8 minutes. I talked about my father's vision for the foundation and what it had meant to try to honor that vision through actual work, rather than through the idea of work. I talked about the people the foundation had served and why that mattered to me independently of any financial consideration. I said that I had not spent 4 years at the foundation thinking about the trust. I had not known the trust would matter to me until it did, and that what I hoped the panel could see in the record was not a competition won, but a direction chosen and consistently followed. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table, and the panel deliberated. What? They were out of the room for 53 minutes. Ethan and I sat in the conference room with Dana Park and the 2 associates, and we did not speak to each other for most of it. About halfway through the wait, Ethan got up and stood at the window, looking out at the Hartford skyline, and I watched him from across the room and thought about all the years we had spent in this city, in this family, circling each other in patterns that had been set before we were old enough to choose them. At some point he said, without turning around, "You were always going to be better at this than me." I don't mean it as a compliment or an insult, he said. I just mean it as a fact. You're wired for it. The work, the patience, the actual caring about something beyond yourself. I watched Dad do it, and I couldn't make myself do it, and you just did it naturally, and I think somewhere along the way, I decided that meant there was something wrong with you, rather than something I was missing. I didn't say anything for a moment. Dana had become very interested in her laptop screen. "You were always going to get the money," Ethan said. "Not because of the trust, because that's the person you are, and he knew it, and I think even I knew it, and that's probably part of why I spent 30 years being angry at you without admitting that's what I was." "Ethan, I'm not asking for your sympathy." He finally turned from the window. His face was composed, but something behind it was not. "I'm not having a moment. I'm tired of performing. I've been performing since I was 20 years old, and I'm 53, and I'm in debt, and my father is dead, and I'd like to stop performing for 10 minutes. "Then stop," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he almost smiled. Not the full version, not the weapon, just the small, unfinished version that I remembered from when we were children. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He came back to the table and sat down, and we waited out the rest of the 53 minutes in a quiet that was, for the first time in a very long time, not adversarial. When the panel returned, Whitmore spoke first. "The panel has reached a determination," he said. He did not soften the approach or build toward it. Under the terms of the Victor Sequesson Hale Legacy Trust, and based on the full record of the 18-month evaluation period, the trustee panel finds that Ethan Hale has not met the conditions for trust distribution as defined in sections 4, 7, and 9 of the document, and is accordingly disqualified under the conduct clause specified in section 11. Ethan nodded once, jaw tight, eyes forward. He had known. He had said he knew. But knowing a thing and hearing it pronounced are different, and I watched him absorb it and stay in his seat and not perform anything, and I thought, there it is. That's the thing my father was waiting for. That's the version of his son that cost him 4 years of silence and a 63-page trust and a year of dying to produce. Too late for my father to see it, but real. Pursuant to Section 12, Whitmore continued, the panel has evaluated the alternate beneficiary record and finds that Olivia Hale has demonstrated sustained documented stewardship consistent with the testator's stated values and the requirements of the trust. He paused briefly. The Victor C. Hale Legacy Trust, in the amount of $30 million, is awarded to Olivia Hale, effective upon completion of the standard transfer documentation. The room was quiet. I did not feel what I expected to feel. I had thought, in the abstract moments where I had allowed myself to think about this outcome, that there would be something larger, relief or satisfaction or the particular warmth of a parent's posthumous approval made financial and legal and real. What I actually felt was something much smaller and less clean, something that was mostly grief because the person I most wanted to call was the person who had arranged all of this and was not available to call. And the money was real and significant, and I understood that. But my father was still gone, and the foundation still needed running, and my brother was sitting 3 feet away from me, having just been told that his whole life had confirmed exactly what his father feared. Patricia Cho was speaking, something about the transfer timeline, the documentation process, the practical next steps, and I was hearing the words, but they were distant, like sound coming through water. I was looking at Ethan, who was looking at the surface of the table with the expression of a man doing difficult interior arithmetic. After the panel finished, Whitmore asked if either of us had questions. Ethan said, "No." I said, "No." We both stood. I gathered my folder. Ethan straightened his jacket. And then, right there, in the conference room of Whitmore and Associates on the 14th floor of a building in Hartford's financial district, with Dana Park pretending to sort papers and the 2 associates doing the same, my brother looked at me and said the 3 most direct, unperformed words he had spoken to me in 30 years. Take care of it. Not the money, the business, the foundation, the legacy. Everything our father had spent his life building. I understood him completely. "I will," I said. He nodded. He picked up his jacket from the chair, and he walked out. I stayed behind for 20 minutes to sign preliminary documentation. When I finally came out through the building's glass doors onto the street, the Hartford afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of November day that feels sharp at the edges, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment just breathing, just letting the air be cold and real around me. My phone had 4 messages. Stuart Marsh, who somehow always knew, Aunt Carla, Marcus Webb from Hale Industries, and a number I didn't recognize that turned out, when I listened, to be a board member from the Foundation's partner organization in the North End, a woman named Terry who had been working with us for 2 years and was calling about a grant renewal that was completely unconnected to any of this, a regular piece of regular work that needed doing. I called Terry back first. I don't fully know why, except that it felt right, felt true to something. The work was still the work. The grant renewal still mattered to the 400 people in that program regardless of what had been decided on a 14th floor this morning. I stood on a Hartford sidewalk in November and talked through grant timelines with Terry for 12 minutes. And by the time I hung up, something in me had settled. Not resolved, not healed, just settled. The way things do when you find the ground under your feet after a long time of not quite feeling it. I called Stuart Marsh back next. He answered on the first ring. "Well," he said. "It went the way it was going to go," I said. The same thing I had told him months ago, after the first trustee meeting. A silence. Then, "And Ethan?" I thought about the table and the 53 minutes and take care of it. "He's going to be okay," I said. "I don't know when, but I think he's going to be okay." "Your father would—" Marsh started and then stopped himself. "I know," I said. I did know. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Some things need a little more time before the words fit around them properly. I stood on the sidewalk until the cold started working through my coat. Then I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove back to the foundation offices, because there was a grant renewal to finalize and a board meeting to prepare for, and a workforce development program that needed its third-year funding confirmed before December, and all of that was still there, still real, still mine. The money was $30 million, but the work had always been what mattered. My father knew that. He had always known that. He had just needed one of us to prove it. The grant renewal came through on a Friday, 3 weeks after the hearing. Terry called me at 8:15 in the morning, before I'd even reached the office, and the sound in her voice, that particular quality of relief that comes when something you've worked hard for finally lands, was one of the better sounds I had heard in a long time. We talked for 20 minutes about the third-year expansion, about the new cohort of participants coming in January, about a partnership with a local community college that we'd been building quietly for 6 months, and that was finally ready to formalize. By the time I walked through the foundation's front door, I had 3 things on my to-do list that had nothing to do with trusts or trustees or family dynamics or $30 million. That felt correct. That felt like the right way to re-enter my own life. The trust transfer had not yet fully cleared. These things move slowly through legal systems regardless of how clean the determination is. But Gerald Whitmore had confirmed the timeline, and the documentation was in process, and there was nothing left to wait on except the bureaucratic machinery doing what bureaucratic machinery does. I had told almost no one. Stuart Marsh knew. Dana Park knew, obviously. Marcus Webb had worked it out from context. But I had not made an announcement, had not posted anything, had not called relatives or sent emails or done any of the things that a person might do when they have just been awarded $30 million. Partly that was temperament. I had never been the kind of person who led with good news about herself. But partly it was something else. A feeling that the moment needed to be held carefully before it was handed around, that there was still something unresolved in it that an announcement would paper over prematurely. That unresolved thing had a name, and it drove a rental car to my foundation offices on a Wednesday morning about a month after the hearing and knocked on my door at 10 a.m. wearing jeans and a jacket I didn't recognize, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the cart downstairs like a peace offering. Ethan looked different, not dramatically. He hadn't lost 20 pounds or grown a beard or undergone some visible physical transformation, but something about the way he carried himself had shifted. The precision of his posture was the same, but the performance underneath it was quieter. He handed me one of the coffees and sat across from my desk and looked around the office for a moment. At the stacks of files and the whiteboard covered in grant timelines and the framed photos on the wall, one of which was a picture from the Workforce Development Program's first graduation ceremony 2 years ago, a woman in her 40s holding a certificate and crying in the good way. "I've never actually been in here before," he said. "No," I said. "You haven't." He nodded slowly, taking that in the way it was meant. Not as an accusation, just as a fact with weight. "How are you doing?" I asked. "Honestly?" He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Some days better than others. The line of credit situation it's being sorted. I had to sell the McLaren." I didn't say anything. "Got about 60% of what I paid for it, which is what you get when you need to sell something quickly," he said. "The Scottsdale deposit is gone. That was just gone. I'm talking to a financial restructuring person. Not a lawyer, just someone who helps people organize the mess." He paused. "It's humbling, sitting across from someone who's younger than you and explaining how you got yourself $400,000 into debt on assumptions. It's a very particular kind of humbling." I imagine it is. She didn't judge me. The restructuring person. She just looked at the numbers and said, "Okay, here's what we're working with," and started mapping it out. That was almost harder than being judged. Just Here it is. No drama, just the reality of it. I understood that. Sometimes the absence of drama is the most confronting thing of all. What are you doing for work? I asked. He looked at me carefully, like he was checking whether the question was loaded. Marcus Webb called me, he said, about 2 weeks after the hearing. He asked if I'd be interested in coming on in a project manager capacity, not senior VP, not an executive title. Project manager, hourly accountability, weekly reporting, the whole structure. He paused. I said yes. I set down my coffee. Marcus offered you that? He said it was your idea. I had called Marcus the week after the hearing and suggested, carefully, without pressure, with significant room for him to decline, that if Ethan came to him genuinely, it might be worth finding something real for him to do, something with structure and accountability and no shortcuts built in. Marcus had thought about it for 3 days before calling me back and saying he was willing to try it for 90 days. It wasn't my idea exactly, I said. It was a suggestion. Marcus made his own call. Ethan looked at me for a moment. Why? Why what? Why would you do that? After everything. I thought about how to answer that honestly, because the honest answer was not simple. It was not because you're my brother, and it was not because Dad would have wanted it, and it was not any of the clean, sentiment-shaped things that fit neatly into a moment like this. The honest answer was messier than any of those. Because watching you fail completely and permanently was never what I wanted, I said. Not even when I was angry at you. Not even when you were doing the Raymond Doyle thing and I was sitting in my car trying to figure out how much of it was deliberate. I never wanted you gone. I wanted you different. I wanted you to be the version of yourself that you showed up as at the hearing. That one sentence, take care of it. That was the most honest thing you've said to me in 30 years. I wanted that person to have somewhere to go. Ethan was quiet for a long time. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the photo of the woman at graduation. She looks happy, he said, meaning the woman in the photo. She is. She got a job at the community college 6 months later. She's in their administrative office now. I paused. She grew up 4 blocks from the house we grew up in. Something moved across his face at that. He nodded, slowly, processing it. That's what the money is for, he said. Not a question, an understanding. That's what Dad always said it was for, I said. Not the foundation money specifically, all of it, the whole thing he built. It was supposed to mean something beyond the building of it. What happened over the following year was not a transformation in the way that word usually gets used, sudden, dramatic, a before and after, with a clean line between them. It was slower and more uneven than that, and I want to be precise about it because I think the imprecision is actually the important part. Ethan showed up at Hale Industries 3 days a week and did the work Marcus gave him to do. He was not brilliant at it immediately. There were weeks where Marcus called me with a tone that suggested patience was being tested. There was one incident in February involving a contractor dispute where Ethan reverted, briefly but visibly, to the version of himself that relied on charm and authority he no longer technically had, and Marcus had to have a direct conversation with him that apparently lasted 90 minutes and left both of them exhausted. But he came back the next week, and the week after that, and the work, the actual granular, unglamorous work of managing a construction project through its permits and its budget overruns and its difficult subcontractors, started to do something to him that 50 years of expectation and entitlement never had. It gave him something real to point to at the end of a day, something he had actually done with his own effort that existed independently of his father's name or his family's money or the performance of competence he'd spent decades substituting for the real thing. He called me on a Thursday evening in April, which was unusual. Ethan was not a Thursday evening phone call kind of person by habit. We came in under budget on the Riverside phase, he said. First time a project I've managed has come in under budget. How far under? $80,000. Not huge, but it's real, I said. It's real, he agreed. And the way he said it, quiet, a little wondering, like someone handling something fragile and new, I recognized that tone. I had heard it for the first time at the hearing, and I had been waiting to hear it again. It was the sound of a man encountering his own competence without the scaffolding of inherited advantage holding it up. "Tell Marcus," I said. I did. "What did he say?" A pause, and then Ethan made a short sound that was almost a laugh. He said, "Good. Now do it again." "That's very Marcus." "Yeah." The almost laugh again. "Yeah, it is." The debt took longer than the work did. These things always do. Financial restructuring is not a story with a satisfying pace. It is slow and grinding and requires a particular kind of patience with your past self that does not come naturally to anyone, least of all to someone who spent 11 years not acknowledging that a loan existed. But Ethan was systematic about it in a way I had not expected. He sent me a message in June with a spreadsheet attached, not asking for anything, just sharing, that laid out his repayment schedule over the next 4 years. It was detailed and realistic and unglamorous, the kind of document that says, "I have looked at this clearly, and I am not looking away." I forwarded it to no one. I just saved it, and I thought about my father's journals with their careful dates and amounts, and I thought about how the habit of documentation, of making things real by writing them down, was something Ethan had apparently inherited after all, just 40 years later than it might have come. There were hard months. I don't want to paper over them. There was a period in late summer when the restructuring hit a rough patch, and Ethan's stress came out sideways in a conversation that left me on the other end of the phone with my jaw clenched, recognizing the old patterns trying to reassert themselves. The deflection, the subtle blame shifting, the framing of consequences as things that happened to him rather than things that resulted from choices he made. I let him finish. And then I said as calmly as I could manage, "Ethan, I love you, and I'm not available to be the person you take this out on." Silence. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." 2 sentences. No performance, no elaboration, no pivot to another topic. Just "you're right," and "I'm sorry," and then a quiet that was different from all the earlier ones. Not the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but of someone who has said exactly what needed saying and is sitting with it. We talked for another hour that night, about the restructuring, about the project he was managing, about a memory of our mother that surfaced unexpectedly in the middle of the conversation and made both of us go quiet in the tender way that the dead can make you go quiet when you're not prepared for them. We talked like people who have been through something large together and are on the other side of it, which is a different kind of talking than anything before. The Foundation's 4th-year report came out in October. It was 38 pages long, and it documented everything: the programs, the partnerships, the outcomes, the financials, with the thoroughness that my father's board had always required and that I had always believed in regardless of whether he was watching. Terry's workforce program had served 512 people in 4 years. The community college partnership had produced its first graduating class of 31 students, 26 of whom were employed within 3 months. 3 new neighborhood grants had launched, focused on areas that had been on the Foundation's radar since before I took over operations. Stuart Marsh read the report and called me. "Victor would have read this twice," he said. "He would have found something to critique," I said. "He absolutely would have. On page 23, the budget variance explanation is slightly vague." A pause, and then Marsh laughed. A real one, the kind that came from genuine warmth rather than social obligation. But he would have read it twice. I kept the report in the same folder where I kept everything else from the past 2 years. The legal documents and the trust sections and Dana's compiled summary and the letter from Craig Lester and the text from Ethan that said, "Don't worry about me." Not as trophies, as the record of a thing that happened. My father had believed in documentation, in making things real by writing them down, and I was his daughter in that way, whether I had chosen to be or not. Okay. November came again. 1 year to the day after the hearing, I drove to the family house. Still jointly owned, still standing exactly as it had always stood. The question of its future one we had quietly agreed to leave alone until we were both more settled. I had a key, and I used it, and I walked through the front hall and into my father's study, and I sat at his desk the way I had sat there 2 years ago reading his journals by lamplight. The journals were still in the cabinet. I had not moved them. I had not known what to do with them, and so I had left them where they were, which felt like its own kind of respect. I opened the most recent one to the last entry he had made. Not the one about the mirror, which I had read so many times I had it memorized, but the very last one, written in a hand that was less steady than his usual, the illness visible in the ink. Whatever happens next, I have done what I could with what I had. I am not certain it was enough. I am not certain anything is ever quite enough when you love people as complicated as the ones I love. But I tried to build something that would outlast my mistakes. That will have to do. I sat with that for a long time. Then I heard the front door open. Ethan's voice came from the hallway. "Olivia?" "Study?" I called. He appeared in the doorway. He was wearing work clothes, the kind of jeans and jacket combination that meant he'd come from the job site. He looked tired in the ordinary, decent way of someone who has worked a full day with his body and his mind together. He looked at me at the desk and at the open journal, and he didn't say anything for a moment. "I thought I'd find you here," he said finally. "I come sometimes," I said, "when I need to think." He nodded. He came in and sat in the chair by the window, the same chair Gerald Whitmore had sat in when my father died, and looked around the room the way people look at spaces that hold more history than the walls should be able to contain. "I paid off the first tranche," he said, "of the restructuring, the smallest piece, but it's done, officially cleared." "Ethan, that's real." "It is." He looked at his hands for a second. "It doesn't feel as good as I thought it would. I thought it would feel like relief. It mostly just feels like, okay, what's next?" "That's how it works," I said. "You don't get a parade. You just move to the next thing." "Yeah." He looked at the journal in front of me. "What does it say?" I read it to him, the whole thing, out loud, in my father's words. Ethan sat in the chair by the window and listened, and when I finished, the room was very still. "That's the most he ever said," Ethan said quietly. "I know. In 53 years, that's the most honest thing." He stopped, pressed his mouth together for a second. He could have just said it, any of it. He could have just, "I know," I said again. But he didn't. That was him. That was who he was. "Yes," Ethan exhaled. "And we're supposed to—" "What? Accept that? Love someone for who they were instead of who we needed them to be?" I thought about that carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. "I think that's the whole thing," I said. "I think that's actually the whole lesson. You can spend your whole life waiting for a person to be different, waiting for a father to say the thing, to hand you the thing, to make you whole in the way you decided they owed you. Or you can look at what they actually left behind and figure out what to do with it." I paused. He left behind more than the money. He left behind everything he built, and what he built was good, and it's still here. That's real too. Ethan was quiet for a long time. The room settled around us. "I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago," he said finally. "Not as a boast, as an observation, cautious and honest." "No," I agreed. "You're not. I don't know if it's enough. For what I did. To the investors, to Dad's reputation, to you. I don't know if what I've done since is enough to balance it." "It's not a balance sheet," I said. "It doesn't work like that. You did what you did, and you're doing what you're doing now, and both of those things are true at the same time. That's what being a person is." He looked at me across the desk. "You're very good at this. I've had a lot of practice being the one who has to make sense of things." He almost smiled. I know you have, and I'm sorry for that. I want to speak directly to you now because I've been telling this story for a long time, and there are things I want you to understand before it ends. My father never told me he was proud of me. Not once, in so many words, in the direct and uncomplicated way that I spent years wanting to hear it. What he did instead was spend the last year of his dying life building a structure that said, in 63 pages of legal language, "I see you. I have always seen you. You are the person this was meant for." That is a strange and difficult and very human way to express love, and I'm not asking you to find it admirable. I'm just asking you to understand that it was real. Here is what I learned, not from the money, not from winning, but from the entire 2 years of what you just heard. Entitlement is not confidence. Entitlement is confidence's counterfeit. It looks the same from a distance and it spends the same way in the short term, but it cannot do the thing that real confidence can do, which is survive contact with the truth. Ethan had entitlement his entire life. He had charm and talent and opportunity, and he had a version of himself that worked extremely well in rooms full of people who didn't know him deeply. What he didn't have, what he had to lose everything to begin building, was the actual substance underneath. Your inheritance is not what you are handed, it is what you do with what you are handed. My father understood this. He tried to build a situation in which his son would understand it too. Whether that was the right approach, whether a different kind of father might have produced a different kind of son, I don't know. I've stopped asking that question. It doesn't have a useful answer. What I know is this: the work matters. The daily, unglamorous, nobody is watching work of building something real, that matters. Not because someone is going to reward you for it eventually, not because the universe keeps a ledger, but because the work is the life. The people you serve with it, the structures you build with it, the small decisions you make correctly 1,000 times when you could have made them incorrectly. That is the legacy. Not the number in a trust document. I think about the woman in the graduation photo sometimes, the one on my office wall. I think about the fact that she grew up 4 blocks from the house my father built his empire from, and that something he created with 2 rooms and secondhand furniture eventually helped her stand in front of a room and receive a certificate that changed her life's direction. He never met her. He never knew she existed. But the thing he built reached her anyway. The way things built with genuine intention have a way of reaching people across distance and time. That is what legacy actually means. Not the house, not the cars, not the party with 200 people who showed up because the host was charming, the quiet reach of something built right. Ethan is managing his 3rd project now. He still calls me on Thursday evenings sometimes, and we still talk about the work and about our mother and occasionally about our father, and it is never completely easy, and it is never what you would call resolved, because families are not problems that get solved. They are relationships that get tended or don't, and the tending is its own kind of ongoing work that doesn't end and isn't supposed to. I did not give Ethan the $30 million. I want to be clear about that because the story is tempting to read as building toward a grand gesture of forgiveness. The sister who wins and then hands everything back in a moment of emotional catharsis. That is not what happened. The money went where it was supposed to go. Into the foundation, into the business operations, into the community programs that my father spent his life building toward. The gesture I made for Ethan was not financial. It was the phone call to Marcus. It was the space I left open for him to walk into if he chose to. That was the thing I had to give, and I gave it, and whether or not it was enough is ultimately his story to finish, not mine. Some things you cannot fix for the people you love. You can only leave the door open and mean it when you say you're not going anywhere. My father left me a door. I try to leave them too, for whoever needs one. That is the whole story. That is what the $30 million actually cost, and what it was actually worth, and what neither of those things can fully measure. The legacy was never the money. It was the person you became on the way to deciding what to do with it.